So I'll start out with the basics if my presentation is going to go. So what is plant pathology? So it's the study of the diseases of plants and their management. And what is a plant disease? It's the abnormal growth or function of a plant due to the infection with a pathogen. So like we get a cough or the sniffles or a fever, a plant responds by growing differently, or the leaves and it might turn yellow because the physiology of the plant is disrupted. And what are plant pathogens? It's an organism that colonizes the plant and causes a disease. So there's bacteria, fungi, viruses, nematodes, which are parasitic worms, and there's also parasitic plants. So with the exception of the parasitic plants, we can get the same type of microorganisms to infect us. So there's two types of plant diseases that we usually talk about. There's the biotic or infectious diseases that are caused by the microorganisms or parasitic plants, but there's also abiotic or non-infectious diseases that are caused by chemicals such as fertilizers or pesticides or salt damage. The weather too can cause problems. You got hail, you have sun scald, you have frost, as well as too much or too little water. Both of them cause the same symptoms. The plants will wilt and die. If you have too much water, the plants drown because of the roots don't get enough oxygen. And if you have too little water, the plants can't take up enough water to keep the pressure in the plant veins up so the plants don't wilt. And sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between a biotic or an abiotic disease. There's a couple of more terms. There's signs versus symptoms. So a sign is when you see the actual structure of a pathogen, just like a fruiting body, or you see nematodes crawling around, or bacterial slime oozing from a plant. You see a mushroom growing at the base of a tree. That can be a pathogen. Whereas the symptom is the damage or the reaction of the plant to the infection. So you see wilting of the plant, you see necrotic or brown spots on leaves or fruit, you see chlorosis or yellowing of the plants, and you see witch's brooms, which is the abnormal growth of a branch that you can sometimes see. Some pathogens produce hormones that cause all the buds on a branch to grow a shoot, so you get these very dense clusters of shoots that are growing. You see it oftentimes in trees caused by mistletoes, but you can sometimes also see it caused by bacterial-like organisms on vegetables or roses. And you can get rotting plants, you can get rotting roots, you can get rotting fruit. That's another type of symptom. So here are a few pictures of a sign. So here, I don't know if you can see the cursor, but this is a conch that's produced by a wood decay fungus on a log that has fallen down. And you can see all that orange dust on that leaf. Those are the spores or the seed of a fungus that it produced. And each single one of those could colonize another branch or a log and cause it to decay. Here, these orange tendrils you see coming out of that aspen log are masses of spores that are stuck together. And if there's water splashing on those, the spores will disperse and then cause new infections in another spot on that log, or they're splashed to neighboring logs and they can then cause a disease again. So these are all things you can look for if you have a plant that looks kind of sickly. Here's a symptom that's caused by tomato spotted wilt virus on tobacco. You see all these brown dead leaves, and eventually this plant will die. It's too young when it was infected and it will not survive. You can also get rot when you store onions, for example. So very common is something like botrytis neck rot. It's a fungal disease that enters the bulb through the neck area up here. And then if you have it in storage 6 to 8 weeks later, you cut it open and you see all this brown, rotten top part of the bulb, and eventually it will colonize the entire bulb. You can also get bacteria that infect onions, like these ones here. You can see that ooze. Oops, let me go back. You can see that ooze coming off of that bulb, and that is because these bacteria have enzymes called cellulases that dissolve the cell walls, and so all the cell contents will pool and create this liquid ooze. That's a mixture of bacteria and cell contents. That's very characteristic for bacterial diseases. You can also just get some brown necrotic lesions. This is a virus on onions called iris yellow spot virus. If it just causes these few small lesions, it's not a big deal, but eventually if these excuse me, if these lesions enlarge and they merge, you might get the whole leaf or the whole stalk to die. And then you get either small onions if the leaves die, or if you would be going for seed production, the seed stalks will break off and you won't get any onion seed. Not everything that looks like a disease is a disease. So if you look at these pictures here, initially you could think this might be a fungal disease, but then if you look closer, you see scratch marks in here, and this damage was actually caused by porcupines. Now, in order to get disease, you need to have 3 components in place. First of all, you need a plant that's susceptible to a disease. Then you need to have the pathogen present that would cause the disease. And then you need the right environmental conditions for the disease to occur. So for example, powdery mildew, like the picture that Nick showed you in first on the squash. Powdery mildew likes it dry. It only needs a little bit of humidity for a few hours. And after that, it can be dry. Most other fungi like it wet. So if we have a very rainy summer, you will see very little powdery mildew because it's too wet for it. But if we have a dry summer like right now, and you have some irrigation, and there's a little bit of dew developing or high humidity for a few hours among those plants, and the powdery mildew is present, you could get disease. You could get an infection. Pathogens are spread and transmitted in a lot of different ways, and sometimes in ways that we aren't really thinking of. So insects can spread a lot of pathogens. They can spread fungi, bacteria, viruses, and nematodes. And some fungi and viruses are actually specialized in being transmitted by insects, by specific insects. Seed can also be carrying a lot of pathogens. It's therefore important that when you buy seed, to make sure that it's certified disease-free seed. Most companies who do certify their seed will say so on their website. You can spread pathogens on soil if they're soil-borne fungi or bacteria or nematodes, and you have the soil on your shovel or other tools that you use. Some cases, even shoes, if you walk through over bare ground, you could move pathogens to another part of your garden. So you always want to rinse off any dirt that's still attached to the shovel or other tools. Humans are very good at spreading pathogens. Let's say you have powdery mildew on your squash and you walk through, these spores fall off very easily and they will attach to your clothes. And then you walk and brush by another squash plant that is not infected and you deposit the spores onto that plant. Or for some viruses like tobacco mosaic virus, that virus is very stable in plant sap. So if you have, let's say, tomato sap from an infected tomato plant on your hands and you touch a healthy plant, you can transmit that virus just touching that plant. Wind can spread fungal spores long distances. So some diseases like soybean rust was first found in Louisiana, and it was thought to have come in on a hurricane from the Caribbean. Powdery mildew can also be spread for hundreds of miles, the spores. So you cannot necessarily blame your neighbor if you end up with powdery mildew on your squash or some of your other plants. Rust spores, it's another fungus you can also get for hundreds of miles. Wheat stem rust has an alternate host called barberry. And initially, they thought if they eradicate the barberry, they would take care of the problem. But then it turned out that the rust can survive without the barberry. And so you have the rust show up first in the southern part of the United States. And then once the wheat is ready in the northern part, the spores blow north with the wind and cause infection on the wheat in the northern states. Rain can spread fungi and bacteria short distances, like I showed you with these orange spores. If the raindrops hit the spores, it just splashes them short distances, but it could be enough to infect more leaves or another branch. And then animals can also transmit some insects, especially mistletoes, that are transmitted by birds indirectly. The seed of the mistletoes are sticky, and when the birds have eaten the fruit, the seed is stuck to their beak, so they wipe the beak on a branch, and then the seed will stick to the branch, germinate, and grow a new mistletoe shoot. And then, of course, the global plant movement. We import a lot of plants, we export a lot of plants and produce. And even though they get inspected, there's just such a big volume of it that they will not find every single pathogen or insect that comes in. A few diseases are easy to diagnose. So for example, there's powdery mildew on cucumber. That white powdery dust that gives it the name, it looks like you took a bag of flour and you sprinkled flour on the leaves. It's very characteristic for the disease. However, even though it looks the same more or less on every plant, there's a lot of different species of powdery mildew, and a lot of them are very host specific. So if you have powdery mildew on your cucurbits, it will not go to your tomatoes or peppers. Likewise, if you have powdery mildew on your lawn can be entirely white, and it will not go to any of your other plants that are not in the grass family. Then up here on the left, we have fire blight, which is very common here in Utah on apples and pears. And it has the name because the young shoots in the spring will turn brown and look like they have been burned. And so as soon as you see these young shoots, the tip bends, that's called a shepherd's crook, but they don't always do that. You see that those shoots starting to die back, you need to prune them out immediately. Otherwise, eventually you will lose your trees. And in this picture, they waited too long to prune them all out. And eventually, from what I've heard, they had to take out that orchard because the trees were just no longer productive. If you do prune it out, so you have to go 12 inches below where the dead part of the tree, the branch is, because the bacteria have already moved on that caused the disease, and you just don't see the symptoms yet. If you just cut it off right behind where the dead tissue ends, you will be cutting again a few weeks later because there'll be more of that branch that has died back. And then down here we have a picture of a parasitic plant called dodder. You can see that sometimes along the highways. It looks like a mass of tangled fishing line. So it's very characteristic, and it has a structure called a haustorium. It's a little peg that it punches into the stem of another plant, and then it sucks the cell contents and water from that plant, and that's how it grows. If you cut those vines off, they can reattach themselves for 3 days before they die, so you need to remove them. If you had problems in the past with dodder, and you want to plant something, get everything ready to plant, wait for the seed to germinate, and the seedlings come up like straight sticks out of the ground, and they can live for 10 days without a host. So just wait those 10 days, and then once the seedlings have died, you're good to plant. Now, some symptoms can also look very similar between different pathogens, and a visual identification is not always possible. So a more specialized test would need to be done if you wanted to know exactly what the problem is. So here we have two diseases, bacterial spot on tomato. Nick showed you the same disease on pepper. You get these little necrotic spots on the leaves. This is tomato spotted wilt virus, and you also get these small necrotic lesions on the leaves. If you just look at them without testing and you don't have any fruit for comparison, you will not be able to 100% distinguish between the two diseases. If a disease can't be completely identified, you could narrow it down in some cases to what type of pathogen it might be. So bacteria often cause water soaking. You see these water soaked, wet looking spots on the bean. Sometimes you see oozing of bacteria from plants. In this case, this is fire blight, bacteria oozing from that pear. Or as with the onion I showed you, they produce enzymes that turn the cell wall or dissolve the cell walls and basically turn whatever you have into a liquid, like this potato down here. And in some cases, bacterial pathogens like Erwidia keratovera, which cause that rot of the potatoes, can also create some nasty smells. Viruses cause symptoms that are often very distinct. So watermelon mosaic virus, for example, this is a young banana squash and it is full of warts. Normally it doesn't have those, but watermelon mosaic virus can cause these warts on the fruit to develop. This is watermelon mosaic virus on a summer squash. This summer squash is ripe and is just as ready to eat as this one that's yellow. It just will not change color because of the infection. It's perfectly fine to eat, it just looks different. Tomato spotted wilt virus on tomatoes, you get these calico patterns of yellow, red, and orange that are very distinct. And then rose mosaic virus is a group of viruses on roses, and the pattern here, the zigzag pattern, is very common on roses, so you've probably seen that, but it doesn't do anything else. That's all that you see. Rose will grow just fine. Fungi do not have very distinct diseases that make it easy, besides the powdery mildew, to differentiate them. So there you would have to look more closely, see if any mold or anything develops, but with fungi that can also often be secondary. They wait for somebody else to kill the tissue and then they come and join the buffet. Abiotic problems, you can identify that they occur on all plants of the same species overnight. So if you had like 100 roses and overnight they all showed the same symptoms, a pathogen would not do that. It would have gradually coming on. There would be one plant here and one plant there that would show symptoms. But if it's an abiotic problem caused by a chemical or herbicide that has been applied, you would see these symptoms overnight. Spray damage, you can identify by looking down on a plant, and I'm a terrible artist, but maybe you can get the idea. You look down on the visible part of the plant and only that part shows symptoms. So if you have two leaves where the upper leaf is covering parts of the lower leaf, and you only see the symptoms, let's say brown spots, on that upper leaf and on the parts that are visible on the lower leaf, then that's usually an indication of spray damage. If you take that part away and then everything that was covered by that upper leaf looks perfectly healthy, it's not a disease. Let me talk a little bit more about abiotic problems, because there are some questions that I get all the time, and people do not necessarily take certain things into consideration, especially when applying herbicides. If you apply herbicides to your lawn, or you apply weed and feed, the weed part in weed and feed is an herbicide. And if you have trees that are growing along your lawn, the roots can extend into the lawn, and if you apply an herbicide, the roots will take that up, and you can get herbicide damage on your trees, even though you did not spray the herbicide directly on the tree. Likewise, if you have weeds that you killed with an herbicide and you put them on your compost pile, composting will not necessarily destroy the herbicide. And if you apply that compost in your yard, you can get a lot of herbicide damage from that herbicide residue that's still in the compost. The same applies to manure. If if herbicide has been applied to a pasture, it goes straight through the animal's stomach and gut, and the manure will still have the herbicide in it, and it will cause damage on your plants. Now, if you want to diagnose samples, or you want to send a sample to us for diagnosis, a strong hand lens, 16x to 30x, can be a very valuable tool for small insects, as well as looking for fruiting bodies of some fungi. A knife, pruners, and a shovel, so you can collect samples, putting them in Ziploc bags or plastic containers or vials to ship. You can send samples to us at the diagnostic lab. We have a sample sheet on our website. We like you to fill in, and you can choose from the different services depending how detailed you want the information to be. And there are some fees associated with various tests that we can do. We also like to know what type of plant it is. Sometimes we get a stick with no leaves, and all it says is it's a plant. That does not help us, because we cannot narrow down what the disease might be if we have no idea what type of plant it is. Also, the symptoms, describe them in as much detail as you can, and provide us with a representative sample. So last week we got a turf sample. The turf looked perfectly fine, and the description of the symptoms was, the symptoms get worse as the summer happens. Well, that does not help us very much, because we didn't really know what to look for. And then lastly, do not compost diseased produce you buy at the grocery store. You can buy diseased produce at the store sometimes, and those are diseases that we do not have in Utah. And if you compost, let's say, the raspberries with the raspberry rust, or the lettuce with the downy mildew on it, spores could potentially survive and blow with the wind to neighboring areas where they could potentially colonize lettuce or other raspberry plants.